always figured the wildest moments in life happened during the day. Big choices, poor decisions, spontaneous ideas. But I was wrong. It's actually at night, when the streets are deserted and the air feels thick, that the weird stuff starts happening. Max had reached out a few days ago, telling me about this new arcade. He'd heard rumors around town, something called Midnight Arcade. The catch? It only opened after midnight. It seemed like one of those gimmicks, a marketing trick meant to draw in people by making them curious. We weren't the kind of guys to fall for cheesy stunts, but this one felt different. The more Max went on about it, the more intrigued I got. People were saying strange things about this place, some claiming that those who went in came out changed or sometimes never came out at all. At first, it sounded like one of those silly urban myths, but Max's excitement was hard to ignore. Besides, it was just an arcade, right? It was 11:55 p.m. when Max and I found ourselves standing in front of what was supposed to be the famous Midnight Arcade. We were both disappointed when we saw it. The building was a rundown, boarded-up mess, standing alone in the cold night like it was abandoned. The windows were caked with dust, and the crumbling brickwork made it look like it could fall apart any second. Hard to believe this was the place everyone had been talking about. Is this some kind of joke? Max groaned, his breath visible in the chilly air. He kicked a loose rock on the sidewalk, obviously frustrated. Who gave us this address? This place is a dump. I nodded, but something didn't sit right. The arcade had gotten too much attention, or rather, too much bad attention, to be a complete hoax. People had been talking about it like it was some kind of legend, something you couldn't just happen upon. There were stories, crazy ones, about what went on inside. But standing in front of this decaying building, that all seemed impossible. Maybe it's just some big prank, I muttered, starting to turn away. We should just head out. Max shrugged and followed me, clearly let down. We had driven all the way out here in the dead of night for nothing. But as we started heading back toward the car, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, a faint hum, like the buzz of electricity. Then, from behind us, I saw it. A soft, flickering light reflecting off the pavement, growing brighter by the second. We stopped dead in our tracks. Slowly, we turned around, and what we saw left us speechless. The old, abandoned building had vanished. In its place stood a glowing, vibrant arcade, like something straight out of an 80s dream. Neon lights bathed the entire building in blues and pinks, flashing in a pattern that felt almost alive. Above the entrance, a new sign blazed with bright blue letters, Midnight Arcade. The lights danced across the walls, reflecting off the now clear windows. Inside, I could see rows of arcade machines, all buzzing with sound and light. Max's eyes went wide. Dude, this is insane. How did they even pull this off? It's like some wild illusion. I didn't know what to think. My brain was scrambling to process what just happened. A minute ago, the place was falling apart, and now it looked like it had popped out of another world. But instead of asking questions, Max was already heading toward the entrance, his excitement bubbling over like a kid seeing a toy store for the first time. Come on, Sam, he called back. This is too cool. We can't miss this. Even with everything feeling so off, I found myself following him, curiosity pulling me toward the door. The arcade seemed to hum with energy, like it was alive, calling us in. Once inside, the place was even more surreal. There were rows and rows of glowing machines, each one buzzing with life. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and something metallic, like old coins. A nostalgic soundtrack of arcade beeps and clicks filled the space, but it was eerily quiet. No other players in sight. The machines were a mix of retro and modern, an odd blend of the past and present. It was like a gamer's dream, but something was off. Man, check this out, Max shouted, running over to one of the machines. They've got everything here. He didn't wait for me. He slid into the seat of an old racing game, and as soon as his hands hit the wheel, the screen lit up. I wanted to say something, to tell him to hold on and think about what had just happened outside, but I kept quiet. Max had a habit of diving headfirst into things. I leaned against one of the machines and watched as he started playing. The car on screen roared to life, racing down a neon-lit highway. Max grinned, weaving through traffic like he was born for this. For a moment, everything felt normal. But then something changed. First, I thought it was just me, but I could see it too clearly now. Max's grin faded, his grip on the wheel tightening. His posture shifted, like he was uncomfortable, but he didn't stop. The car swerved on screen, but it wasn't like before. It was like he was struggling against something, like there was an invisible force he was fighting. Moksh! I called out, taking a step closer. He didn't respond. The car on the screen swerved violently, crashing into a barrier. The words "Game Over" blinked in harsh red letters, but Max remained still. His eyes were locked on the screen, wide and unblinking. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Moksh! I shouted, grabbing him by the shoulder. He snapped out of it, gasping for air like he had just come up from underwater. His chest heaved as he looked around, completely disoriented. What just happened? I wasn't sure how to explain it. You kind of zoned out there. You all right? Before he could answer, the lights in the arcade dimmed. A low, mechanical hum filled the air, and all the machines powered down, their screens flickering to black. That's when it started. A large screen in the middle of the arcade, one I hadn't noticed before, flickered on. The display looked ancient, like it came from some old computer with blocky green text flashing across it. Rule 1. You must play the game you're drawn to. The words seemed to hover in the air, thick with meaning. Wait, what the hell? I muttered, staring at the screen. Max's face turned pale, and he took a step back. Drawn to? I just picked a random game. The screen stayed still for a moment, as if waiting for us to process what we had read. Then the text shifted again. Rule 2. You must finish the game. My heart raced as I read it. Finish the game? Max rubbed his temple, looking uneasy. It hit me then. He hadn't been drawn to the racing game. He had picked it randomly, and he hadn't finished it. Before either of us could say anything, the screen changed once again. Rule 3. No second chances. A chill ran down my spine. The arcade now felt different, more suffocating, like the walls were closing in. Rule 4. Never look away from the screen while playing a game. The moment those words appeared, the lights flickered again, casting odd shadows around the room. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Rule 5. Never play a multiplayer game alone. I glanced at Max, trying to make sense of it all. Play a multiplayer game alone? That doesn't even make sense. But Max wasn't listening to me anymore. His gaze was fixed on the screen, and his breathing was starting to get faster. Rule 6. You cannot leave until you've won at least one game. Escape before sunrise, or you'll vanish with the arcade. Max turned to me, his face drained of color. This isn't a joke, is it? I shook my head, feeling the weight of it all. I don't think it is. Once the last rule flickered off the screen, Max and I stood frozen, the suffocating silence of the arcade pressing down on us. It felt real now, the weight of what had just happened, the realization of where we were. Dude, this isn't right, Max muttered, his voice shaking. His wide eyes darted around the arcade, searching for a way out, for something that made sense. It has to be a joke, right? Maybe we're on some hidden camera show? Like a prank. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He didn't believe it either. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I don't know, man. But whatever this is, we need to get out of here. Without thinking, we both ran for the front door. My shoes squeaked on the sticky linoleum as I grabbed the handle and pulled with everything I had. Nothing. I tried again, pulling harder, but the door didn't budge. The neon lights outside flickered through the reinforced glass, and no matter how hard I yanked, the door felt like solid concrete. Come on, Max shouted, his voice frantic. He slammed his shoulder against the door, gritting his teeth as he tried to force it open. This can't be happening. It was open before. I stepped back, dread creeping over me. It was happening. We were trapped. My hands were shaking now, sweat making my palms clammy. We need to think, I muttered, more to myself than to Max. There's gotta be another way out. But Max wasn't listening. He kept tugging at the door, his breath coming quicker with every attempt. "This isn't real," he said, almost as if trying to convince himself. "It's just a setup, a gimmick." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe this was all some elaborate trick. But the look on his face told me he knew, deep down, what was really happening. The door wouldn't open. We were stuck in the arcade. Then, a sharp, high-pitched noise cut through the silence. We both turned, scanning the room. It was coming from deeper inside the arcade, where the machines stood in their eerie neon glow, flickering like they were alive. A multiplayer machine had powered up, its screen flashing wildly. The game's speakers blared to life, echoing through the empty room. A tinny jingle repeated over and over, growing louder, more insistent. The words "press start" blinked in time with the flickering lights. Max and I exchanged a glance. "No way," he whispered. "I'm not touching that thing." But we didn't have a choice. The rules were running through my mind, especially Rule 6. You cannot leave until you've won at least one game. The arcade had chosen us. It was dragging us toward that machine, pulling us into the game whether we wanted it or not. "We have to," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "We don't have a choice." Max stared at the screen, his face as pale as a ghost. The flashing lights from the machine reflected in his wide eyes, making him look like a deer caught in headlights. "You saw what happened last time. I didn't even pick the right game. This isn't normal, Sam." "I know," I replied, stepping closer to the machine. The screen flickered more violently, the text blinking faster, urging us to sit down. "But if we don't play, we're not getting out of here." Max hesitated for a moment longer, then exhaled shakily. "This is insane." "Yeah," I agreed, "but we have no other option." The game in front of us was a racing one, but it wasn't like the one Max had played before. This machine was bigger, with 2 seats and 2 sets of controls. The title screen flashed to life in bright, attention-grabbing letters: Dual Race, Escape Velocity. Below it, pixelated cars revved their engines, waiting for us. Max and I reluctantly slid into the seats, our hands hovering over the controls. The arcade around us felt alive, watching, waiting. The machine seemed to be pulling me in, like it wouldn't let go until we were fully committed. "You ready?" I asked, my voice trembling. Max shook his head. "Not even close." With a deep breath, I gripped the steering wheel, and the game jolted to life. The countdown began. 3, 2, The screen exploded with movement as our cars shot forward down the track. The visuals were dizzying, bright flashes of light, twisting roads looping and spiraling like something out of a nightmare. I could hear Max's car revving next to mine, the sound of tires screeching against the digital pavement filling the air. But something felt off. As I sped down the track, familiar sights began to appear. The track warped, turning into something that looked eerily like the roads in our own town. It was as if the game was pulling pieces of our reality into its warped version of the world. Max and I weren't racing through some generic arcade setting anymore. We were racing through memories. I swerved to avoid a sudden obstacle. An old playground I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The swings creaked in the wind, abandoned and ghostly as I sped past. Up ahead, I could see Max's car, weaving through obstacles with more and more panic. "Sam!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is messed up. I know that place. That's my old school." I saw it too. The track was warping further, reshaping into a twisted version of places we knew, places from our past. But something was wrong. Everything looked decayed, abandoned. The trees were twisted, the buildings crumbling. It was like the game was feeding off our memories, warping them into a nightmare. The speed of the cars picked up, and my heart raced along with it. The turns got sharper, the obstacles more dangerous. My hands were sweating, gripping the wheel tighter, trying to hold on. But no matter how fast I went, the world around me kept distorting. And then, up ahead, I saw it. Versions of myself. Figures driving identical cars, racing beside me. They looked like me, but their faces were twisted, distorted into mocking grins. They were shadows of me, taunting me from the corners of my vision. Max's voice broke through the panic. "Sam, look out!" I barely had time to react before my car slammed into one of the figures. The impact rocked the machine, and the screen flashed bright red as my car spun out of control. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt like I was being ripped from my body, like something else was trying to take the wheel. The screen blinked. "You lose." The game froze, but I was still gripping the wheel. Slowly, I released my hands and turned to look at Max. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he let go of the controls. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I saw myself out there. It was like I was racing against me." I nodded. "I saw it too." Max slumped back in his seat. "We're screwed, Sam. This place. It's not normal." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were trapped in this twisted nightmare, and the arcade was playing by its own set of rules. The doors wouldn't open, the games were rigged, and sunrise was getting closer. And there were still more games to play. My heart was still pounding from the last race, as Max and I sat in the cold silence of the arcade. The screen in front of us blinked off, leaving us in the eerie glow of the neon lights. I wiped sweat from my forehead, trying to calm my breathing. My hands were still shaking from gripping the wheel too tight. Max stared at the machine, silent. I stood up, my legs weak, knees trembling. As I took a step forward, a strange sensation washed over me. At first, it was subtle, like a faint buzzing at the back of my skull. But then it spread through me, crawling down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling intensified. My movements became stiff, jerky, as if I was fighting against something invisible. "Sam, you all right?" Max's voice was laced with panic. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell Max that I was fine, that we could handle this, but the words wouldn't come. My body felt wrong. I tried to lift my arm, but it wouldn't obey. My legs, though, moved on their own, dragging me toward the center of the arcade like some invisible force had taken control. I was trapped in my own body. "Sam!" Max called out, grabbing my shoulder, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even turn to look at him. My feet shuffled across the floor, dragging me forward, my limbs stiff and jerky, like a puppet on strings. My mind screamed at me to stop, to fight, but there was nothing I could do. I was helpless. It felt like I was being overtaken by the thing from the game. The figure that looked just like me, the one with the twisted grin, lurking in the shadows of the race. I circled around the arcade, my arms twitching, my head jerking slightly with each step, as if my body was glitching. For a few moments, I was just a spectator, watching myself move, helpless to control anything. The arcade blurred around me, and my vision flickered, going in and out. Then the control loosened. I stopped moving. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. My body felt like my own again, but my head spun as I lay there, trying to figure out what had just happened. I could still feel it, the presence of that shadow hanging on the edges of my mind. "Sam!" Max kneeled beside me, his face pale with fear. "What the hell was that? You were moving like you weren't even there." I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. I don't know. It felt like something was controlling me. My chest tightened as I looked at him. "I don't understand." Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed through the arcade, coming from one of the darker corners. I turned, my body still weak, and saw another machine lighting up. The title flashed on the screen in blocky letters, "Whispers of the Woods." The whispers grew louder as I stared at the screen. The flickering images of a dense, shadowy forest filled the screen, and I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to play, but the arcade had made its choice and the rules were clear. We had to play whatever game drew us in. Max looked at me, shaking his head. "You can't play that one, Sam. After what just happened." But we both knew it didn't matter. My body was already moving, pulling me toward the machine like it was being guided by some invisible force. I stepped up to the glowing screen, the whispers swirling around me like a cold wind. I could almost feel them crawling under my skin, urging me forward. I pressed start. Whispers of the woods. The screen flickered, and the game began. It was a first-person perspective, my character standing in the middle of a dark, twisted forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting unnaturally, and the ground beneath my feet was covered in thick, dead leaves that crunched with each step. A soft wind blew through the trees, carrying ghostly whispers that echoed in my ears. I started moving, the character trudging slowly through the dense woods. The whispers grew louder, though the words were unclear and unsettling. I couldn't see anything around me, just an endless stretch of trees and darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Felt like eyes were on me, watching from the shadows, waiting just out of sight. As I ventured deeper into the forest, glowing eyes appeared in the distance, flickering between the trees. Every time I tried to get a closer look, they darted away, as if playing a game of cat and mouse. The objective was simple: collect items and escape the woods, but whenever I found something useful, like a flashlight or a map, it vanished from my inventory as soon as I tried to use it, disappearing into thin air like it never existed. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. "Come closer," they coaxed. "You'll be safe here." I didn't trust the voices. I kept moving, searching for a way out, but the trees seemed to close in on me. The glowing eyes were getting closer, flickering in my peripheral vision. I felt like I was being hunted, like whatever was out there was closing in with every second. The game was messing with my mind, twisting my sense of direction. The whispers never stopped, always urging me towards something unseen, something lurking just beyond the trees. But I refused to follow them. I kept moving, kept searching for the exit. And then I saw it. A creature stepped out from behind the trees, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. It was tall, standing on two legs, its body flickering like it was slipping between realities. The whispers grew deafening, almost overpowering, as the beast moved toward me, its eyes boring into mine. I ran. The forest seemed to twist around me, the path shifting with every turn. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps silent but its presence suffocating. The whispers screamed in my ears, but I kept running, dodging through the trees, desperately searching for an escape. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance, just beyond the trees. The exit. I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, the creature still chasing me, its glowing eyes burning into my back. I broke through the trees and into the light. The game froze, the screen flickering once more before the words "you win" flashed in bright, mocking letters. I let out a shaky breath, stepping back from the machine, my legs weak and my mind spinning. Max rushed over, his face filled with concern. Did you win?" Max's voice was barely a whisper, filled with uncertainty. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "Yeah, I think so." Max paced back and forth beside me, still rattled by everything we'd been through, but doing his best to hold it together. I could barely focus, my mind still buzzing with the echoes of the whispers and the tension still tight in my muscles. But the rules were clear: we couldn't stop. We had to keep going. As if on cue, another arcade machine flickered to life, its screen flashing with distorted images. The title blinked across the screen in jagged letters: Mirror Maze Madness. Max flinched when the machine powered on. He turned toward it slowly, his shoulders tight with reluctance. "I guess it's my turn now." I didn't say anything. We both knew he had no choice. The arcade had picked him just like it had picked me. We couldn't escape it. The only way out was to keep moving forward. Max walked over to the machine, casting a quick glance at me before sitting down. He stared at the screen for a moment, his fingers hovering over the joystick. Then he pressed start. Mirror Maze Madness. The screen lit up, harsh and bright, casting a sharp glow over Max's face. The game began, showing a first-person view of the character standing at the entrance to a maze made entirely of mirrors. The reflective surfaces stretched out in every direction, creating an endless labyrinth of shimmering corridors. "This looks unsettling," Max muttered, gripping the joystick tightly. As he moved through the maze, the reflections in the mirrors began to lag behind the movements of his character. It wasn't immediate, just a slight delay, as if the reflections were a fraction of a second off. But the longer Max played, the worse it got. Eventually, his own reflection appeared in the mirrors of the game, and with each move he made, it felt wrong. "This is weird," Max said, eyes locked on the screen. "The reflections look like me." I watched as the reflections began to change. In one corner, I saw his reflection grinning. It raised its hand, as if beckoning him down a dead-end corridor. Max stiffened. "Did you see that?" His voice was strained, his hand trembling on the joystick. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep calm. "Just keep going." Max hesitated for a moment, but then pushed forward into the maze, dodging wrong turns and dead ends. The mirrors continued to warp, distorting his reflection in strange ways. Some of the reflections began to gesture for him to follow them, their eyes fixed on him, their smiles stretching unnaturally wide. "They're trying to trick me?" Max muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "They want me to take the wrong turn." The maze twisted and looped in on itself, and the reflections became more aggressive. One of them leaned close to the screen, its face contorted in a grotesque sneer. It pressed its hands against the glass, like it was trying to reach through and pull Max into the game. I stood off to the side, watching the game unfold, my heart pounding in my chest. Max kept his focus, carefully maneuvering through the maze. Some of the mirrors began showing him as older, haggard, as if the game was aging him before my very eyes. Then, without warning, Max glanced at me, just for a second. I was standing to his right, barely out of his line of sight, his face twisted with fear. "Sam!" he shouted, his voice cracking. I froze, my heart racing. What is it?" He didn't answer at first. His eyes were wide with terror. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking past me. I turned around, my stomach dropping, but there was nothing there. Just the empty arcade and the neon lights softly blinking in the dark. "There was something behind you," Max whispered, his voice barely audible. A chill ran down my spine. "Don't look away from the screen," I whispered, remembering the rules. "Just finish the game. Keep your eyes on the screen." Max nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped the controls again. He forced his attention back to the game, his eyes glued to the flickering mirrors. As he navigated the final twists and turns of the maze, his reflections began to lag even further behind. They grinned wickedly, beckoning him into a corner, but Max didn't follow. He stayed focused, avoiding the dead ends. Finally, he reached the exit. The screen flashed, "You win," and the game froze. Max exhaled a shaky breath, leaning back in his seat. "I made it," he whispered, though his voice trembled with doubt. "I got out." I studied his face carefully, but the relief I expected never came. There was something off about his expression, something that made me feel like the game wasn't done with him yet. As Max stood up from the machine, I saw him glance at one of the reflective surfaces nearby, the glass of one of the arcade's machines. His face went pale again. "Sam!" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look!" I followed his gaze to the glass. First, it seemed normal, but then I saw it. In the reflection, something was wrong. Max's reflection was smiling at us, even though the real Max wasn't. It was a faint, twisted smile, but it was there, for just a moment. Then it flickered and vanished as soon as I blinked. Max's eyes darted to every reflective surface around us. The glass of the machines, the windows, anything that cast a reflection. His reflection was still there, still twisted, still wrong. "It's following me," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I keep seeing it in the reflections. It's not me." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. The arcade wasn't just messing with us. It was warping reality. And I knew whatever Max was seeing in those mirrors wasn't just his imagination. The games were bleeding into the real world, and I had no idea how much more we could handle. I glanced at a dark corner of the arcade, and there it was, the creature from the Whispers of the Woods game. I could feel its presence in the room, lurking in the shadows. Its faint, glowing eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked at it too long, that creature would step out of the shadows and into the light.
"Some," Max whispered, barely audible.
What do we do now? I tried to focus, but the weight of the arcade pressed down on me, suffocating. The rules had been clear: win the games to escape. We'd each won. I had beaten the forest. Max had made it through the maze. According to the rules, we should be able to leave. We should just be able to walk out that door and never look back. Max took a step toward the door, his movements slow, careful. Do you think it's over? Can we get out? I wasn't sure, but we had to try. Let's see, I said, my voice rough. We made our way to the exit, the neon lights flickering around us. Max reached for the door handle, his hand shaking as he gripped it. He tugged. Nothing. The door didn't budge. Damn it, Max muttered, pulling harder, panic rising in his voice. Why isn't it opening? We did what it wanted. We played the damn games. That's when it happened. A low hum filled the arcade, the lights dimming as the central screen flickered back to life. The same blocky, retro text appeared on the screen, glowing bright against the dark. Final game. Max took a step back from the door, eyes wide. What the hell is this? I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The rules had never mentioned anything about a final game. I swallowed hard, dread building in the pit of my stomach. The text shifted, each word hitting me like a blow to the chest. To escape, you must play one final game. Face your worst fears. Face the arcade. I looked over at Max. His face had drained of color. His fists were clenched, his body tense with shock and anger. This can't be happening. We beat the games, Sam. We did everything we were supposed to do. But the arcade wasn't finished with us. It wanted more. I felt it again, the pull. Stronger this time, like the walls themselves were alive and closing in on us. The air around us felt thick, electric, like the arcade was shifting, preparing for what was to come. The machines flickered in unison, and the shadows seemed to stir, like something dark and massive was waiting just beneath the surface of reality. The screen blinked once more, the game loading. The title flashed across it, the final test. The image that accompanied it made my skin crawl. And then, the lights went out. The entire arcade was plunged into total darkness. The hum of the machines died down, leaving only an eerie, suffocating silence. For a moment, I thought I had gone deaf. There wasn't even the sound of our breathing. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing behind me in the pitch black. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and then a distorted voice crackled to life. You are the prey, it rasped, a warped, almost inhuman tone that made my skin crawl. Survive for 1 hour. The air seemed to freeze. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. Before I could even react, the voice crackled once more, the static growing louder. The hunt has begun. Suddenly, a blinding light tore through the darkness. But it wasn't coming from any of the arcade's machines. It was coming from the door, the same door that had been locked, refusing to open. Now it stood wide, leading out into the streets. But something was wrong. I sprinted for the exit, my footsteps echoing off the walls. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The town was no longer the familiar place I had known. The streets twisted in impossible patterns, looping back on themselves, with buildings towering like crooked giants. Streetlights flickered erratically, casting unnaturally long shadows. I looked around, desperate to get my bearings, but everything was warped. The streets I recognized had been stretched out, elongated, and the landmarks had become grotesque versions of themselves. And the people, as I raced through the streets, I passed people. People I should have known, people I had grown up with, but they were all wrong. Their faces were turned around, staring at me over their shoulders, while their bodies faced the other direction. Their mouths gaped open, impossibly wide, as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. Behind me, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, heavier. The pursuer. I didn't dare look back. I kept running through the distorted streets, the ground beneath my feet feeling like quicksand. Each step grew harder, as if the earth itself was fighting me. I could hear it behind me, gaining on me, the sound of something enormous and relentless. As I turned a corner, the world twisted once more. The street ahead looped back on itself, the buildings bending, their shapes warping like liquid. My legs felt heavy, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, just like that, I was no longer outside. I found myself back inside my childhood home. The walls that once felt familiar were cracked and decaying. The furniture had warped, covered in a thick layer of dust. The photos on the walls showed distorted versions of my family. Faces blank, featureless, staring into nothingness. I stumbled through the living room, my mind spinning. It was all wrong, every inch of it. I pushed forward, but the house itself twisted around me. The walls stretched, bending into long, dark hallways. The whispers from the forest game filled the air again, growing louder with each step I took. My heart raced as I sprinted down the hall, the walls closing in around me. And then I saw them, people from my past, people I hadn't seen in years. Old friends, teachers. They stood motionless in the corners of the room, their eyes blank, lifeless. Their bodies didn't move, but their faces followed me, turning at unnatural angles. I felt suffocated, trapped. These twisted versions of the people I once knew closed in on me, their eyes unblinking, their mouths stretched open in eerie silence. And then I saw him. It looked like Max. He stood at the far end of the room, his back to me. But something was off. His movements were jerky, unnatural. Slowly, he turned to face me, and when I saw his face, my blood ran cold. It was Max, but not really. His eyes were gone, and his mouth was open wide, revealing sharp, long teeth. The Max I knew was gone, replaced by something monstrous, something that wore his face like a mask. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. The pursuer was closing in. I ran, bursting through the door of the house and back into the warped streets. The world around me twisted even more, the streets looping endlessly. No matter where I turned, I ended up back where I started. Reality was crumbling. I could hear Max's voice behind me. No, not Max. The thing that had become Max. It was mocking me, its laughter echoing in my ears as the chase grew more desperate. The twisted figures on the street turned to watch me, their eyes following my every move. Then, just as the terror reached its peak, everything stopped. The world stood still. For a moment, I was frozen, gasping for breath. The twisted figures around me faded, the streets dissolving into nothingness. Then, complete darkness. The distorted voice crackled one last time. You survived. The lights flickered back on, dim and weak, as if struggling to stay lit. I was no longer in the arcade. I stood in an abandoned, decaying building. The floor was coated in dust, and the walls were cracked, peeling paint flaking away in chunks. The arcade was gone. My heart raced as I spun around, trying to make sense of where I was. The door, the same one we had tried to escape through, hung open, leading into the faint glow of early morning light. Mox! I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. Silence. Panic surged in my chest. I searched the room, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. Mox! Where are you? I staggered toward the door, my legs weak beneath me, barely able to hold me up. I stepped out into the cold, pale morning light. The world outside seemed normal again, but the dread that clung to me wouldn't let go. I turned back toward the dilapidated building, the place that had once been the arcade. And then I saw it. Just a flash, a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. Someone standing by the side of the building, watching me. I froze. It was Max. His face was the same, but there were no eyes, just an empty void. His mouth was open, full of sharp, long teeth. And then, just as quickly, he glitched. He was gone. I haven't gone back to that part of town since. When I tried to tell anyone what happened, they looked at me like I was insane. Some laughed, saying that building had been empty for years. But I know what I saw. I haven't heard from Max since that night. His phone is disconnected, and no one's seen him. His family filed a missing persons report, but the police found nothing. It's like he just disappeared. And maybe he did. Maybe the arcade took him. Sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear the faint hum of arcade machines. I'll catch a glimpse of something in a mirror, just a flicker, a shadow. It's always him, Max, standing there, watching. The worst part? Sometimes I wonder if it's really him, or if it's something else. Something that followed me out. I don't go near mirrors anymore. And every night, I check the clock.